My son Michael drove me to Riverside Manor Nursing Home under the pretense of visiting a friend, only to reveal he'd already signed the paperwork to have me admitted to what he called the cheapest place that would take you. What he didn't know was that I'm the anonymous benefactor who funded the entire facility, and my name is on every deed, every contract, and every major decision that gets made there. At 72, I never imagined I'd be standing in the lobby of a building I secretly built, watching my own son try to abandon me there because he considered me a burden. But as the administrator recognized me and the truth began to unfold, Michael's face went white as a sheet. Why sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones closest to home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sofia Rodriguez, and at 72 years old, I've learned that the most painful betrayals often come wrapped in the language of love and concern. For most of my adult life, I believed that success was measured, not by what you accumulated, but by what you quietly gave away. I was wrong about many things, but I was especially wrong about my son Michael. I came to this country from Mexico when I was just 19, carrying nothing but a suitcase full of dreams and a work ethic that my grandmother had instilled in me from childhood. "Mija," she used to say, "the world will try to make you small, but your hands and your heart can build something bigger than their expectations." Those words became my guiding principle, though I never imagined they would one day be tested in such a cruel way. My first job in America was cleaning offices downtown for $3 an hour. Every morning at 4, I would take 2 buses across the city to reach the gleaming corporate towers where important people made important decisions. I scrubbed their floors, emptied their waste baskets, and listened to their conversations about business deals and investment opportunities. Most of them never acknowledged my presence, but I was absorbing everything. During my lunch breaks, I would sit in the building's lobby and read discarded newspapers, particularly the business section. I learned about stocks, real estate markets, and something that fascinated me completely: how successful people thought about money. They didn't just earn it, they made it work for them. While my English was still improving, numbers were a universal language I understood perfectly. It was in those corporate buildings that I met Roberto Martinez, a night security guard who shared my immigrant dreams and work ethic. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at St. Mary's Catholic Church, with our combined savings of $800 as our entire nest egg. Roberto worked nights, I worked days, and together we began building something neither of us had ever dared to imagine. When Michael was born 3 years later, everything changed. Suddenly, we weren't just working for ourselves anymore. We had a tiny person depending on us, and that responsibility transformed our ambition into something fierce and unrelenting. Roberto took on extra shifts, and I started a small cleaning business from our 1-bedroom apartment, slowly building a client base among the wealthy families in the suburbs. The turning point came when Mrs. Harrison, one of my regular clients, mentioned that she was selling her rental property because managing tenants had become too stressful. The house needed work, but the price was reasonable. With Roberto's encouragement and our life savings, we bought that little 2-bedroom house, fixed it up ourselves, and rented it out. The monthly income wasn't much, but it was our first step toward financial independence. Over the next 15 years, we repeated this process dozens of times. Buy, renovate, rent, save, repeat. Roberto learned plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos and library books. I taught myself about property management, tenant law, and market analysis. We never took vacations, rarely ate out, and drove the same reliable Honda for 12 years. Every extra dollar went back into the business. Michael grew up watching us work constantly, but I don't think he ever understood what we were building. To him, his parents were just the people who couldn't afford name-brand cereal and who made him wear hand-me-down clothes to school. When his friends' parents bought new cars or took elaborate vacations, Michael would come home embarrassed and frustrated. "Why can't we be normal?" he would ask during his teenage years. "Why do you guys have to work all the time?" I tried to explain that we were working towards something bigger, that the sacrifices would pay off eventually, but teenagers don't think in decades. They think in moments. The moment when everyone else had nicer things, went to better restaurants, lived in bigger houses. What Michael couldn't see was the growing portfolio of properties that would eventually provide security for our family's future. Roberto passed away suddenly when Michael was 25, just as our business was reaching its peak. The heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning while he was replacing a water heater in one of our rental properties. The doctors said it was quick, that he didn't suffer, but I suffered enough for both of us. Losing the love of my life and my business partner in the same moment felt like losing my entire identity. For months after Roberto's funeral, I considered selling everything and moving back to Mexico. The properties, the responsibilities, the constant phone calls from tenants, it all felt overwhelming without Roberto's steady presence beside me. But late at night, going through his tools and notebooks, I found something that changed my mind. Hidden in his toolbox was a letter he'd written but never given me, dated just a week before his death. "Sofia," it read, "if something happens to me, don't you dare give up on what we built together. This business isn't just about money. It's about proving that people like us can create something lasting in this country. Michael will understand someday. Keep building, mi amor. Keep giving. The world needs more people who remember where they came from." So I kept building. I hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations and focused on expansion. Within 10 years, I owned 47 rental properties across 3 counties, from modest apartments that housed working families to luxury condos that attracted young professionals. The business was generating more income than I could spend in several lifetimes. That's when I started giving it away. It began with small donations to local charities, $5,000 here, $10,000 there. But as my wealth grew, so did my desire to make a real impact. I funded scholarships for undocumented students, built playgrounds in low-income neighborhoods, and secretly paid medical bills for families facing bankruptcy due to healthcare costs. The recipients never knew my name. I worked through lawyers and shell companies to maintain complete anonymity. My most ambitious project began 5 years ago when I learned about the shortage of affordable nursing home beds in our county. Too many elderly residents were being forced to choose between inadequate facilities they could afford and quality care that was financially out of reach. The problem reminded me of my own grandmother, who had died in an overcrowded public facility in Mexico because we couldn't afford anything better. I spent 18 months researching the issue, consulting with healthcare experts, and developing a plan. The result was Riverside Manor Nursing Home, a state-of-the-art facility designed to provide excellent care at prices that working families could manage. I funded the entire $12 million project through a complex web of anonymous donations and shell corporations, ensuring that my involvement remained completely secret. The facility opened 3 years ago to widespread community praise. Local newspapers called it a miracle and proof that affordable quality care is possible. Politicians took credit, healthcare administrators won awards, and I watched from the shadows with quiet satisfaction. This was Roberto's dream realized, creating something that would help people like us, people who worked hard but couldn't always afford the best life had to offer. Michael knew nothing about any of this. As far as he was concerned, his mother was a widow living modestly on rental income, someone who clipped coupons and shopped at discount stores. He saw the small apartment I'd moved into after Roberto's death, observed my simple lifestyle, and concluded that his parents' years of hard work had yielded nothing more than a comfortable but unremarkable retirement. What Michael didn't see were the financial statements showing assets worth over $20 million. He didn't know about the charitable foundation I'd established, or the hundreds of families whose lives had been quietly transformed by anonymous donations. In his mind, I was just an aging woman who'd never accomplished anything particularly noteworthy, someone whose immigrant story was more about survival than success. This perception suited me perfectly. I had learned early in life that real power often came from being underestimated, from allowing others to make assumptions while you quietly built something they couldn't imagine. The corporate executives whose offices I had cleaned never suspected that the quiet woman emptying their trash cans was absorbing their business strategies. Similarly, my son never suspected that his supposedly simple mother had become one of the county's most significant philanthropists. But maintaining this facade came with costs I hadn't anticipated. Michael's lack of respect for what he perceived as my limited achievements created a distance between us that grew wider each year. He visited out of obligation rather than genuine interest, and our conversations rarely went beyond surface pleasantries. When I tried to share stories about my work or express opinions about current events, he would nod politely but dismissively, the way adults respond to stories told by people they consider to be living in the past. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades building something meaningful, something that would outlast my own life and help countless people. But the person whose opinion mattered most to me, my only offspring, saw me as someone who had never really accomplished anything worth his attention or respect. Still, I loved Michael deeply and held on to hope that someday he would see me as more than just his aging mother who needed managing. I believed that love, patience, and time would eventually bridge the gap between us. What I didn't anticipate was that Michael's misunderstanding of who I really was would lead him to make a decision that would change everything between us forever. The foundation of our relationship, built on his assumptions about my limitations and my quiet acceptance of his dismissive attitude, was about to crumble in the most dramatic way possible. And in that collapse, both of us would discover truths about ourselves that we had spent years avoiding. The pattern of dismissal didn't develop overnight. It grew slowly, like rust on metal, until it had corroded the very foundation of respect that should exist between a mother and her adult son. Michael's attitude toward me had been shifting for years, but it crystallized into something unmistakably condescending after he married Patricia and started climbing the corporate ladder at Henderson & Associates, a prestigious accounting firm, downtown. Patricia came from what people politely called good stock. Her father was a federal judge, her mother served on the boards of several charitable organizations, and their family name appeared on buildings around the city. When Michael first brought her home to meet me, I could see her taking inventory of my modest apartment, noting the secondhand furniture and the absence of anything that suggested wealth or social standing. Her smile was polite but strained, the kind reserved for people you must tolerate but don't particularly respect. "It's so nice that Michael comes from such humble beginnings," she told her friends at their engagement party, as if my background were some kind of character-building obstacle that Michael had heroically overcome. It really gives him perspective on how fortunate we are. Michael began adopting Patricia's perspective on our family history. Where he had once been simply embarrassed by our working-class lifestyle, he now seemed to view it as something to be diplomatically managed. During family gatherings, he would steer conversations away from any mention of the rental properties or my business activities, instead encouraging me to talk about safe topics like gardening or the cooking shows I watched. "Mom likes to keep busy with little projects," he would say when Patricia's friends asked about me, as if my life's work could be summarized as harmless hobbies for an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. The shift became more pronounced after their wedding, an elaborate affair held at the country club where Patricia's family had been members for 3 generations. I had offered to contribute to the costs, but Michael waved away my suggestion with embarrassed laughter. "Mom, that's sweet, but Patricia's parents have everything handled," he said. "Besides, weddings like this well, they're not really your thing, you know?" I knew exactly what he meant. The wedding cost more than most people earned in 2 years, with flowers flown in from Ecuador, and a string quartet that had performed at the governor's mansion. I could have paid for the entire celebration without touching my principal investments, but Michael assumed I was living month to month on modest rental income. In his mind, his mother's financial contribution would have been a small, potentially embarrassing gesture from someone who couldn't really afford it. So I attended my son's wedding as a politely tolerated guest, rather than as a contributor to the celebration. I wore a dress I'd owned for 5 years, sat at a table with distant relatives I barely knew, and watched Michael and Patricia receive gifts that cost more than my monthly rent. The irony of sitting there with $20 million in assets, while being treated as the poor relative, wasn't lost on me, but I maintained my silence. The pattern continued as Michael and Patricia established their life together. They bought a house in West Ridge Estates, one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, and filled it with furniture that Patricia selected from high-end boutiques. When they invited me for dinner, which happened perhaps once every 2 months, Michael would give me subtle warnings about the conversation. Patricia's been under a lot of stress with her interior design business, he might say. Maybe don't mention anything about your tenant problems tonight? She doesn't really understand that side of things. What Michael didn't realize was that I understood Patricia's business better than he did. I had researched her work after their engagement and discovered that her design business consisted primarily of redecorating the homes of her mother's friends, wealthy women who paid her generous fees more out of social obligation than genuine need for her services. Her design philosophy seemed to center on purchasing the most expensive version of whatever was currently fashionable, without much consideration for functionality or long-term value. But I kept these observations to myself, just as I kept most of my thoughts about their lifestyle choices to myself. When Michael proudly showed me their new BMW or Patricia's latest jewelry purchases, I offered appropriate compliments and asked no uncomfortable questions about how they could afford such luxuries on his accountant's salary and her sporadic design income. The truth was that Patricia's parents were subsidizing their lifestyle substantially. Her father had purchased their house as a wedding gift, though the deed remained in his name. Her mother paid for Patricia's expensive shopping, trips under the guise of business investments in her design career. Michael's pride prevented him from acknowledging this financial dependence directly, but it created a peculiar dynamic where he felt both superior to his working-class mother and insecure about his own achievements. This insecurity manifested in increasingly condescending behavior toward me. When I would mention news articles I'd read or opinions about current events, Michael would respond with the kind of indulgent smile usually reserved for the elderly sharing irrelevant observations. "That's interesting, Mom," he would say, then immediately change the subject to something he considered more appropriate for my understanding level. During one particularly memorable dinner at their house, I had mentioned reading about the city's housing crisis and the shortage of affordable senior care facilities. I was genuinely interested in Michael's perspective as someone who worked with numbers and budgets professionally. "I wonder if there are creative financing solutions that could help address the problem," I said, thinking about my own anonymous contributions to Riverside Manor and similar projects. Michael exchanged a knowing glance with Patricia before responding. "Mom, these are really complex economic issues. The city has teams of experts working on this stuff. It's not something that has simple solutions." The dismissal stung more than he probably intended. Here I was, someone who had actually contributed $12 million toward solving exactly the problem we were discussing, being told that I couldn't possibly understand the complexity of the issue. But I swallowed my irritation and nodded as if his explanation had been enlightening. The pattern extended beyond economic discussions. When I mentioned books I'd read, Michael would suggest that I might enjoy lighter reading instead. When I expressed interest in traveling, he would recommend bus tours designed for seniors rather than the international trips I could easily afford. When I talked about wanting to learn new skills, he would suggest crafts or hobbies rather than anything. He considered intellectually demanding. "At your age, Mom, it's important to have realistic expectations," became his standard refrain whenever I expressed ambitions that exceeded his limited vision of what elderly women should attempt. The most painful aspect of this pattern was how it affected our communication about practical matters. When I tried to discuss my finances with Michael, hoping to gradually reveal the true scope of my assets, he would interrupt with assumptions about my limitations. "I know money's tight on. Your fixed income," he would say, even though I had never indicated any financial stress. "Patricia and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we can help out if you need anything." Their offer of help, while well-intentioned, revealed the depth of their misunderstanding about my situation. They saw themselves as the successful family members who might need to support their struggling elderly relative, never imagining that I could have supported their entire lifestyle without effort. This dynamic created a strange parallel existence for me. During the day, I would meet with financial advisors, review property portfolios, and make decisions involving millions of dollars. Then I would visit my son and daughter-in-law, where I was treated as someone who needed protection from complex thoughts and challenging conversations. The contrast became especially stark during family holidays. At Thanksgiving, Michael would insist on picking me up to save me the trouble of driving myself, even though I owned a perfectly reliable car and was comfortable driving anywhere in the city. At Christmas, their gifts to me were always practical items selected for elderly people on limited budgets: warm socks, easy-to-read books, gift certificates to chain restaurants known for senior discounts. Meanwhile, I would give them carefully chosen gifts that reflected thoughtful attention to their interests, items that were nice enough to show love but not so expensive as to raise questions about where I got the money. The imbalance highlighted how little they really knew about who I was, beyond their assumptions about elderly women with immigrant backgrounds. Patricia's influence on Michael's behavior became increasingly apparent over time. She had a talent for making observations that sounded caring but carried unmistakable undertones of condescension. "Sofia is so sweet," she would tell friends in my presence. "She comes from a generation that's just happy to have a roof over their heads. Not like today, when everyone expects so much." These comments revealed Patricia's belief that people from my background should be grateful for modest circumstances and shouldn't aspire to anything grander. Michael never corrected these characterizations, tacitly endorsing Patricia's view of his mother as someone whose expectations had been properly limited by her origins and circumstances. The cumulative effect of years of this treatment was a growing distance between Michael and me. I found myself sharing less about my activities, interests, and thoughts, knowing that anything I said would be filtered through their preconceptions about what elderly immigrant women were capable of understanding or achieving. What hurt most was watching Michael become someone I didn't recognize, a person whose sense of self-worth seemed to depend on looking down on others, including his own mother. The boy who had once been proud of his parents' work ethic had become a man who was embarrassed by our family's humble origins and determined to distance himself from anything that reminded him of where he came from. But I told myself that love meant accepting people as they were, even when they couldn't extend the same courtesy to you. I believed that my patience and understanding would eventually help Michael see past his prejudices and reconnect with the values Roberto and I had tried to instill in him. What I didn't anticipate was that Michael's misunderstanding of my capabilities and circumstances would eventually lead him to make a decision that would force both of us to confront the reality of who we had become to each other. The fall happened on a Tuesday morning in late September, just as the first autumn leaves were beginning to drift across my apartment complex's courtyard. I had been rushing to get ready for an important meeting with my property management team. We were discussing the acquisition of a small apartment building that had come on the market in a neighborhood I'd been monitoring for months. In my haste to gather the financial documents I'd need for our discussion, I misjudged the distance between my coffee table and the couch. My foot caught the edge of the table leg, and suddenly I was falling forward with no way to catch myself. I hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crack that seemed to echo through my apartment. The pain in my left wrist was immediate and intense, but what frightened me more was the sharp ache in my hip and the way my ankle had twisted beneath me. For several minutes, I lay there on the floor, taking inventory of the damage and trying to decide whether I could get up on my own. The wrist was clearly broken. I could see the unnatural angle it made, and moving it sent waves of nausea through me. My hip throbbed with each heartbeat, though I didn't think anything was fractured there. The ankle was swollen and tender, but I could still wiggle my toes. What frustrated me most was the timing. I had worked for weeks to arrange this meeting, coordinating schedules between my property manager, my accountant, and the seller's representative. The apartment building represented exactly the kind of investment opportunity I'd been seeking. A solid property in a developing area that could provide both rental income and long-term appreciation while offering affordable housing to working families. But as I struggled to reach my phone with my uninjured hand, I realized the meeting would have to be postponed. The building acquisition would wait. Everything would wait while I dealt with the immediate crisis of my broken body. I managed to call 911, though explaining my situation through gritted teeth proved challenging. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, professional and efficient, as they assessed my injuries and prepared me for transport. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught sight of Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, watching from her window with obvious concern. I tried to wave with my good hand to reassure her, but the movement sent fresh pain shooting through my ribs. At the hospital, the emergency room staff confirmed what I already suspected: a badly broken wrist that would require surgery, a severely sprained ankle, and several bruised ribs. The hip pain was from deep bruising rather than fracture, which was fortunate, but the overall damage was significant enough to require an overnight stay for observation. "Do you have family we should contact?" the admitting nurse asked as she reviewed my insurance information. I hesitated before giving her Michael's phone number. Part of me dreaded the conversation that would follow. His immediate assumption that this fall proved I was no longer capable of living independently. His rush to implement solutions I hadn't asked for and didn't need. But he was my emergency contact, and hospitals were required to notify family members in situations like this. The nurse made the call while I was being prepped for wrist surgery. Through the fog of preoperative medication, I heard her explaining my condition to someone on the phone, her voice professional but necessarily alarming. Significant injuries, surgery required, overnight observation, all phrases that would sound much worse to Michael than they actually were. When I woke up from surgery, Michael was sitting beside my hospital bed, his face a mixture of concern and something else I couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps, or maybe vindication. His first words confirmed my suspicions about his state of mind. "Mom, thank God you're okay," he said, squeezing my uninjured hand. But this really scared us. Patricia and I have been talking about this exact scenario for months. Even in my medicated state, I found his phrasing odd. They had been discussing scenarios where I would fall and hurt myself. The conversation that followed revealed just how much thought they had already given to what they saw as my inevitable decline. "We've been worried about you living alone," Michael continued, his voice taking on the carefully patient tone I'd grown to recognize as his way of managing what he considered my limitations. "At your age, falls like this can be really serious. You could have been lying there for hours before anyone found you." "But someone did find me," I pointed out. "I called for help myself." Michael nodded, but I could see he wasn't really listening to my response. He had already decided what this incident meant and what needed to happen next. Over the following 20 minutes, as I drifted in and out of medication-induced drowsiness, he outlined the concerns he and Patricia had been discussing. My apartment was on the second floor, requiring me to navigate stairs daily. I lived alone with no immediate family nearby to check on me regularly. I was 72 years old, an age when falls became statistically more dangerous and recovery more complicated. Most importantly, from his perspective, I was too proud or stubborn to admit when I needed help. "Patricia's been researching senior living options," he said, as if this revelation should be comforting rather than alarming. "There are some really nice places that provide different levels of care. You could have your own apartment, but with staff available if you need assistance." The irony of the situation struck me even through the haze of painkillers. Here was my son discussing my need for assisted living, while I owned the very type of facility he was describing. More than that, I had funded Riverside Manor specifically to address the exact concerns he was raising, providing quality care at affordable prices for people who found themselves in situations like mine. But Michael knew none of this. In his mind, his mother was a woman of limited means who had just demonstrated that she could no longer safely live independently. The fall had provided him with concrete evidence to support what he had apparently been thinking for months, that I needed to be managed, protected, and relocated to an environment where professionals could ensure my safety. "We don't need to make any decisions right now," he assured me, though his tone suggested that he and Patricia had already made several decisions without consulting me. "Let's focus on getting you healed first. But Mom, we really need to start thinking practically about your future." What Michael didn't understand was that I had been thinking practically about my future for years. I had considered the various scenarios that might affect my independence and had made careful preparations for each of them. I had resources he couldn't imagine, support systems he didn't know about, and options that extended far beyond what he considered possible for someone in my circumstances. The broken wrist would heal. The sprained ankle would recover. The bruised ribs would stop aching. But Michael's response to my fall, his immediate assumption that this incident proved my incompetence and justified his intervention in my life, revealed something that might be much harder to repair. As I lay in that hospital bed, watching my son discuss my limitations with the casual confidence of someone who had never bothered to learn about my actual capabilities, I realized that our relationship had reached a crossroads. The fall had been an accident, a moment of clumsiness that could happen to anyone at any age. But Michael's reaction to it was no accident. It was the culmination of years of assumptions, prejudices, and misunderstandings that had poisoned his perception of who I really was. During my 3-day hospital stay, Michael visited twice, each time bringing Patricia and a different set of brochures for senior living facilities. They had clearly been researching options extensively, comparing amenities, services, and costs with the thoroughness they might apply to selecting a vacation resort. "This place has a really good reputation," Patricia would say, showing me glossy photographs of smiling, elderly residents engaged in craft activities or seated in comfortable lounges. "And it's not too expensive, considering everything that's included." I wanted to tell them that I wasn't interested in their research, that I had no intention of moving anywhere, and that their assumptions about my financial limitations were completely wrong. But something held me back. Perhaps it was curiosity about how far they would take this intervention without consulting me. Perhaps it was a desire to understand exactly what they thought they knew about my life and circumstances. Or perhaps it was the growing realization that this fall, as painful and inconvenient as it had been, was about to reveal truths about my relationship with Michael that I had been avoiding for years. The accident had stripped away the polite pretenses that had allowed us to maintain a superficially pleasant relationship despite our fundamental lack of understanding of each other. As I was discharged from the hospital with a cast on my wrist and instructions for physical therapy, I had no idea that Michael and Patricia were already implementing plans they had made without my knowledge or consent. I thought I was going home to recover from my injuries and resume my normal activities once I healed. Instead, I was walking into a trap that would force both of us to confront the reality of who we had become to each other. What I didn't know during those weeks of recovery was that Michael and Patricia had interpreted my fall not as an unfortunate accident, but as a clear signal that immediate action was required. While I focused on healing and gradually returning to my normal activities, they were busy implementing a plan they had apparently been developing for months. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital. I was finally feeling strong enough to resume some of my regular business activities, though the cast on my wrist made typing difficult, and I still needed to be careful with my balance. I had arranged to meet with my property manager, James Wilson, to discuss several matters that had been postponed due to my injury. When James arrived at my apartment that Thursday morning, his usually cheerful demeanor seemed subdued. He accepted my offer of coffee but appeared uncomfortable as we settled at my dining room table with the financial reports and property updates I'd been eager to review. "Sofia, I need to ask you about something," he said, his voice careful and measured. "I received a strange phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your son." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "Michael called you? What did he want?" James shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "He said he was concerned about your ability to manage your properties after your accident. He asked detailed questions about the business. How many units we manage for you, what the monthly income looks like, whether there are any major maintenance issues coming up." The blood drained from my face. I had never given Michael any information about the scope of my property holdings, and I certainly hadn't authorized him to contact my business associates. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific," James assured me quickly. "I told him that I couldn't discuss your business affairs with anyone without your written authorization." But Sofia, he seemed to know more than I would have expected. He mentioned specific properties by address, and he asked about your insurance policies and legal arrangements. My mind raced as I tried to understand how Michael could have obtained such detailed information about my business. The addresses he'd mentioned to James were not properties I'd ever discussed with him. The insurance policies were handled through my business attorney. The legal arrangements were complex structures designed specifically to maintain my privacy. "Did he say why he needed this information?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. James nodded grimly. "He said he and his wife were exploring care options for you, and they needed to understand your financial situation to determine what you could afford. He made it sound like you had asked him to help with your affairs because of your health problems." The betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity. Not only had Michael decided that I needed to be placed in a care facility, but he was now actively investigating my private business affairs to support his plans, all while telling people that I had requested his help. After James left, I sat alone in my apartment trying to piece together how Michael might have gained access to information I had never shared with him. The answer came to me gradually, and it was more disturbing than I had initially imagined. During my hospital stay, Michael had offered to collect my mail and water my plants. I had given him my spare key, grateful for his apparent thoughtfulness during my recovery. What I hadn't considered was that this access to my apartment also gave him access to my personal files. I spent the next hour going through my home office, checking the filing cabinets and desk drawers where I kept important documents. Everything was still there, but I noticed subtle signs that papers had been moved and folders had been reorganized. Someone had been through my files systematically, photographing or copying documents before returning them to approximately their original positions. The violation felt worse than if someone had simply stolen from me. This was my son, someone I loved and trusted implicitly, who had used my injury and vulnerability as an opportunity to invade my privacy and gather ammunition for plans he was making without my knowledge or consent. But the extent of Michael's scheme became clear only when I received a phone call the following Tuesday from Dr. Margaret Foster, my longtime physician. Her voice was professional but concerned when she called that afternoon. "Sofia, I had a visit yesterday from your son, Michael," she said. "He's requesting copies of your medical records, claiming that you've asked him to help coordinate your care due to cognitive concerns following your fall." My hands began to shake. Cognitive concerns? What exactly did he tell you? He said that family members had noticed confusion and memory problems since your accident, and that you had agreed to have him serve as your healthcare advocate during your recovery. He presented a form requesting full access to your medical history, including mental health evaluations and any assessments of your decision-making capacity. The lie was so outrageous that I initially couldn't find words to respond. There had been no confusion, no memory problems, and certainly no agreement for Michael to serve as my healthcare advocate. The only document I had ever signed regarding healthcare decisions was a directive naming my attorney as my proxy in case of incapacity, a precaution I had taken years earlier as part of my estate planning. "Dr. Foster," I said carefully, "I have not authorized Michael to access my medical records, and I have not experienced any cognitive problems since my fall. Whatever he told you is simply not true." There was a pause before she responded. "I thought his claims seemed inconsistent with my observations during your follow-up appointments. You've been sharp and articulate every time I've seen you. I told him I couldn't release any records without your written consent and proper legal documentation." After hanging up with Dr. Foster, I realized that Michael's scheme was more comprehensive than I had initially understood. He wasn't just casually exploring care options for his aging mother. He was building a systematic case for my incompetence, gathering financial and medical information that could potentially be used to justify legal intervention in my affairs. The pattern became clearer over the following days as I received similar calls from other professionals in my life. My attorney, Franklin Torres, contacted me after Michael had attempted to schedule a meeting to discuss my estate planning needs in light of my declining health. My bank manager called to report that someone claiming to be my son had requested information about my accounts and investment portfolios. In each case, Michael had presented himself as a concerned family member acting on my behalf, often claiming that I had asked for his help but was too proud or confused to make the requests myself. The consistency of his approach suggested careful planning and preparation. What was most disturbing was how he had weaponized my fall to support his narrative. The accident that I viewed as a minor setback in an otherwise healthy and active life had become, in Michael's telling, evidence of dangerous decline that required immediate family intervention. I began to understand that Michael and Patricia had been watching me for signs of vulnerability for months, perhaps years. My fall hadn't created their concerns about my independence. It had simply provided them with the justification they needed to act on plans they had already been developing. The CI. Realization that my own son was actively working to undermine my autonomy and independence was devastating, but what hurt even more was understanding that he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. In his mind, I was an elderly woman whose pride and stubbornness were preventing me from accepting the help I obviously needed. He couldn't see that his assumptions about my limitations were based on complete ignorance of my actual circumstances. He didn't know that I had more resources and professional support than he could imagine. He had never bothered to learn about my business interests, my financial planning, or my careful preparations for aging. Instead, he had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which his immigrant mother needed rescue from her own poor judgment, and he was the responsible family member who would provide that rescue whether I wanted it or not. As I sat in my apartment that evening, reviewing the evidence of Michael's systematic investigation into my private affairs, I realized that our relationship had crossed a line from which there might be no return. This wasn't simply a case of a well-meaning son overreacting to his mother's accident. This was a deliberate campaign to strip away my independence based on assumptions he had never bothered to verify. But Michael had made one critical error in his planning. He had assumed that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a woman of modest means with limited options and no significant resources or connections. He had built his entire scheme around the belief that I would have no choice but to accept whatever arrangements he made for my care. What he didn't know was that his investigation into my affairs was about to reveal truths that would destroy every assumption he had made about his mother's life and capabilities. And when that revelation came, It would happen in the most public and humiliating way possible, in front of the very people he was trying to impress with his responsible management of the family's elderly problem. The call came on a Thursday morning in early November, exactly 6 weeks after my fall. I was sitting at my kitchen table, carefully reviewing quarterly reports from my property management company with my good hand, while my broken wrist continued to heal in its cast. The phone rang just as I was calculating the year-over-year rental, income increases, and Michael's name appeared on the caller ID. "Good morning, mijo," I answered, using the endearment that had always made him smile as a boy. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" His voice carried an unusual tension that I couldn't quite identify. "Much better, thank you. The wrist is healing." "Well, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again." I set down my pen and gave him my full attention. "What's on your mind?" "Actually, I was calling to see if you'd like to take a drive with me this afternoon. Patricia has been visiting her friend Maria at a care facility outside town, and she mentioned that the place has beautiful gardens that are still in bloom despite the season. I thought you might enjoy seeing them." The invitation seemed innocent enough, though Michael rarely suggested spontaneous outings. Usually, our visits were scheduled weeks in advance and revolved around family dinners or holidays. But perhaps my accident had reminded him of the importance of spending time together while we were both healthy enough to enjoy it. "That sounds lovely," I replied. "I've been cooped up in this apartment for too long. A drive and some fresh air would be wonderful." "Great. I'll pick you up around 2 o'clock if that works for you." After we hung up, I felt genuinely pleased by Michael's thoughtfulness. Maybe my fall had served one positive purpose, reminding him that our time together shouldn't be taken for granted. I spent the morning finishing my property reviews and then dressed carefully for our outing, selecting a comfortable sweater and slacks that would be appropriate for walking through gardens. Michael arrived precisely at 2, looking unusually formal in a pressed shirt and tie. When I commented on his attire, he explained that he had a client meeting later that afternoon and hadn't had time to change clothes. His explanation seemed reasonable, though I noticed he appeared more nervous than usual. "So tell me about Patricia's friend," I said as we drove through the suburban neighborhoods outside the city. "How did she come to be at this facility?" Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Maria, she had some health issues that made it difficult for her to live independently. But she really likes the place. Patricia says she's made friends there and seems happy with the care she's receiving." "That's wonderful. It's so important for people to maintain their social connections as they age." I watched the familiar scenery pass by, enjoying the simple pleasure of being out in the world again after weeks of recovery. "What's the name of this place?" "Riverside Manor," Michael replied, and something in his voice made me look at him more closely. My blood ran cold. "Riverside Manor? The nursing home on Elm Street?" "Yes, do you know it?" Of course I knew it. I had funded its construction, supervised its design, and maintained anonymous oversight of its operations for the past 3 years. Every detail of that facility, from the therapeutic gardens Michael had mentioned to the specialized equipment in the medical wing, had been planned and paid for with my money. But Michael didn't know any of this. In his mind, he was taking his mother to visit a random care facility where his wife's friend happened to reside. The coincidence was so extraordinary that I initially wondered if I had misunderstood something. "I've heard of it," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I believe it has a good reputation in the community." "Yes, that's what we've heard too." Patricia did some research, and it seems like a really quality place that doesn't cost as much as some of the fancier facilities. The way he emphasized the cost made me uneasy. Why would Patricia be researching the prices at Riverside Manor unless they were considering it for someone they knew? And why would Michael be taking me there to see the gardens unless... The horrible possibility began to crystallize in my mind, just as we turned into the facility's circular driveway. This wasn't a casual visit to see beautiful gardens. This was something else entirely. "Michael, I said slowly. "Why are we really here?" He parked the car near the main entrance but didn't immediately turn off the engine. For a long moment, he stared straight ahead through the windshield, his jaw working as if he were trying to find the right words. "Mom, Patricia, and I have been talking a lot since your fall. We're worried about you living alone, especially with winter coming. You could have another accident, and next time you might not be able to call for help." "I managed perfectly well this time," I pointed out, though my heart was beginning to race as I realized where this conversation was heading. But what if you hadn't? What if you'd hit your head instead of just breaking your wrist? What if you'd been unconscious? His voice rose with apparent anxiety. "Mom, we can't stop thinking about all the things that could go wrong." "So you brought me here to look at the facility as a potential resident," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Michael finally turned to face me, and I could see the guilt and determination warring in his expression. "We just want you to see what's available. No decisions, no pressure, just keep an open mind." The betrayal was complete, but not yet fully revealed. He had lied about the reason for our visit, manipulated me into coming here under false pretenses, and was apparently expecting me to tour the facility as a potential resident. But the deepest level of his deception was still to come. "Have you already contacted them about me?" I asked, dreading the answer. Michael's silence was confirmation enough. Finally, he nodded. "Patricia spoke with the admissions coordinator last week. We explained your situation, and they have space available in their assisted living wing. The costs are actually quite reasonable, especially compared to some of the other places we looked at." "You looked at other places?" The scope of their planning was becoming clear. "How long have you been researching this?" "Since your fall," he admitted. "Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. We love you, and we want you to be safe. This place has everything you need: meals, medical care, activities, transportation. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining an apartment or dealing with landlord issues anymore." The irony was so profound that I almost laughed. Michael was trying to convince me to move into a facility I had built, using arguments about care and safety that I had considered when designing every aspect of the building. He was worried about costs that were irrelevant because I owned the place. He was concerned about my isolation when I had created this entire community specifically to address that exact problem for people in situations like mine. "And if I don't want to move here?" I asked quietly. Michael's discomfort was obvious. "Mom, we're hoping you'll at least consider it. But if you won't make this decision for yourself, then Patricia and I might have to explore other options." "What kind of other options?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "There are legal ways to ensure that elderly people get the care they need, even when they're not thinking clearly about their own safety." The threat was unmistakable. If I didn't voluntarily agree to be placed in Riverside Manor, Michael and Patricia were prepared to pursue legal measures to force the issue. They would claim I was incompetent to make my own decisions and petition for guardianship that would allow them to override my preferences. "You would really do that to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We would do whatever it takes to keep you safe," he replied. And I could hear that he genuinely believed he was being noble and protective rather than controlling and cruel. As we sat in the parking lot of the facility I had built, with Michael explaining why I needed to be placed there for my own good, I realized that our relationship had been based on a lie so fundamental that it had poisoned everything between us. He didn't know who I really was, what I had accomplished, or what I was capable of. In his mind, I was exactly what I appeared to be, an elderly immigrant woman with limited resources who needed to be managed by more capable family members. But Michael was about to discover that appearances can be deceiving, and that the mother he thought he could manipulate and control had resources and connections he had never imagined. The building we were sitting in front of wasn't just any nursing home. It was my creation, my investment, and my legacy. And when we walked through, Those doors. Everything Michael believed about his mother's place in the world was about to be shattered. "All right," I said finally, opening my car door. "Let's go inside. Let's see what you and Patricia have arranged for me." Michael looked relieved, clearly interpreting my agreement as acceptance of his plan. He had no idea that he was about to experience the most humiliating moment of his adult life, in front of people whose respect and approval he desperately wanted to maintain. The son who had tried to manipulate his mother was about to discover that he was the one who had been operating from a position of complete ignorance and powerlessness. As we walked through the automatic glass doors of Riverside Manor, I felt as though I were entering a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar lobby that I had personally approved during the design phase spread out before us, exactly as I had envisioned it 3 years earlier. The warm earth tones, the comfortable seating areas arranged to encourage conversation, the large windows that flooded the space with natural light. Every detail reflected my vision of what senior care should look like. Michael moved beside me, with the confident stride of someone who believed he was in control of the situation. He had clearly been here before, probably multiple times, familiarizing himself with the facility he intended to make my new home. His familiarity with the layout became obvious as he guided me toward the reception desk without hesitation. "Good afternoon," he said to the young woman behind the desk, his voice carrying the self-assured tone of someone conducting important business. "I'm Michael Rodriguez. I called earlier about the tour for my mother, Sofia." The receptionist, whose name tag read Amanda, looked up with a professional smile that faltered slightly when her gaze fell on me. I watched recognition flicker across her features, followed immediately by confusion. Her eyes darted between Michael and me, her expression clearly indicating that something didn't make sense. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Could you repeat your name?" "Michael Rodriguez," he said again, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "We have an appointment with the admissions coordinator to discuss residency options for my mother." Amanda's confusion deepened. She glanced at her computer screen, then back at me, her professional composure beginning to crack. "And your mother's name?" "Sofia Rodriguez," Michael replied, gesturing toward me as if I were incapable of speaking for myself. The moment Amanda heard my name, her eyes widened in unmistakable shock. She stared at me for several seconds, her mouth slightly open, before quickly composing herself and reaching for her phone. I'll need to get someone," she stammered, her voice betraying her bewilderment. "Could you please have a seat for just a moment?" Michael looked pleased by what he interpreted as efficient service. "Of course. Take your time." As we settled into the comfortable chairs in the lobby's seating area, I noticed Amanda speaking urgently into her phone, her voice too low for us to hear, but her body language clearly conveying the urgency of whatever she was communicating. Michael, oblivious to the undercurrents of the situation, used the waiting time to point out various features of the facility. "See how clean everything is?" he said, gesturing around the lobby. "And look at that artwork. It's actually quite nice. Not at all institutional feeling." I nodded politely, though I could have told him that I had personally selected every piece of art hanging on these walls. The watercolor landscapes were painted by local artists whose work I had discovered at community art fairs. The sculpture near the main entrance was created by a young artist I had sponsored through an arts grant program I funded anonymously. Within minutes, I heard the distinctive click of heels moving quickly across the polished floor. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the facility's executive director, appeared in the lobby, her usually composed demeanor betraying signs of barely controlled amazement. I had worked with Rebecca extensively during the planning phases of Riverside Manor, though our meetings had always been conducted through my attorney to maintain my anonymity. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, approaching us with obvious uncertainty. "What an unexpected... that is, we weren't expecting..." Michael stood up, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who believed he was meeting with a subordinate who would help him solve his family problem. "You must be the admissions coordinator. I'm Michael Rodriguez, and this is my mother, Sofia. We spoke on the phone about the possibility of her joining your community." Dr. Martinez looked at Michael's outstretched hand as if it were a foreign object she couldn't quite comprehend. Her gaze shifted to me, and I could see her struggling to understand how the woman who had funded the entire facility had come to be sitting in the lobby as a potential resident brought by a son who clearly had no idea of his mother's true identity. "I'm actually Dr. Martinez, the executive director," she said slowly, her voice carefully measured. "And Mrs. Rodriguez, I must say, this is quite unusual." Michael's confidence flickered slightly. He hadn't expected to be meeting with the executive director for what he assumed was a routine admission consultation. "Is there a problem? We were told there were openings in the assisted living wing." Dr. Martinez's expression shifted as the full scope of the situation became clear to her. She looked at me with something approaching awe, then at Michael with what could only be described as pity for his complete ignorance of what he had walked into. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said carefully, "I think there may be some confusion here. Are you aware of your mother's connection to this facility?" Michael's brow furrowed. "Connection? What do you mean? She's never been here before today." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the soft, classical music playing from the lobby's sound system. Dr. Martinez looked at me questioningly, clearly seeking guidance on how to handle this unprecedented situation. I gave her the slightest nod, granting permission for the truth to be revealed. "Mr. Rodriguez," Dr. Martinez said, her voice gaining strength as she realized the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Your mother is not just connected to this facility. She is the reason this facility exists." Michael's expression went blank. "I don't understand." "Mrs. Sofia Rodriguez is the anonymous benefactor who funded the construction of Riverside Manor. She provided the $12 million that built this entire facility. Every building, every piece of equipment, every program we offer, it all exists because of your mother's generosity." The color drained from Michael's face so completely that for a moment, I was concerned he might faint. He looked at Dr. Martinez as if she were speaking a foreign language, then turned to stare at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. "That's impossible," he whispered. "My mother doesn't have that kind of money. She lives in a small apartment and clips coupons. She drives a 10-year-old Honda. Dr. Martinez glanced at me again, clearly uncomfortable with revealing details about my private affairs, but committed to the truth now that it had begun to emerge. "Mr. Rodriguez, your mother is one of the most significant philanthropists in our county. Her contributions to community organizations and charitable causes are extensive. The construction of Riverside Manor was just one of many projects she has funded." Michael's legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank back into his chair. "This can't be real. Mom, tell her this isn't true." I looked at my son, this man who had spent weeks investigating my private affairs, contacting my business associates, under false pretenses, and threatening me with legal action if I didn't submit to his plans, and felt a mixture of sadness and vindication that I had never experienced before. "It's true, Michael," I said quietly. "Every word of it." The lobby fell silent except for the soft murmur of residents and staff moving through the background. Michael stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, his entire worldview crumbling, as he tried to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the reality that was being revealed. "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "When would I have told you?" I replied gently. "When you were explaining to me that complex economic issues were beyond my understanding? When you were suggesting that I needed protection from challenging thoughts? When you were researching nursing homes because you assumed I couldn't afford quality care? Dr. Martinez discreetly withdrew to give us privacy for what was clearly a deeply personal family moment. But her departure left Michael and me sitting in the lobby of the facility I had built, surrounded by the tangible evidence of capabilities he had never bothered to discover I possessed. "I don't understand," Michael repeated, his voice taking on the quality of someone trying to wake up from a dream. "If you have this kind of money, why do you live the way you do?" "Because," I said, my voice gaining strength as I finally had the opportunity to explain who I really was, "I learned long ago that true wealth isn't about what you display. It's about what you can accomplish. This building, these programs, the scholarships I fund, the families I help. That's what my money is for. Not to impress my son or his wife, but to make a real difference in the world." Michael's face was in his hands now, and I could see his shoulders shaking. The son who had tried to manipulate and control his mother had just discovered that he was sitting in a building she owned, being treated as an honored guest by staff who knew her as their facility's founding patron, while having just threatened to have her declared incompetent if she didn't accept placement in the very institution she had created. The silence in the lobby stretched on as Michael remained hunched over with his head in his hands, the full weight of his miscalculations settling over him like a crushing physical force. Other residents and visitors moved through the space around us, but our corner of the lobby felt isolated in its own bubble of shock and revelation. Dr. Martinez returned after several minutes, her expression professional but sympathetic as she took in the scene before her. She carried a leather portfolio that I recognized. It contained the original documentation of my donation and ongoing involvement with the facility's governance. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said respectfully, "I apologize for the awkwardness of this situation. If you'd prefer to handle this matter privately, we could move to my office." Before I could respond, Michael looked up, his face red and streaked with what might have been tears. "How much?" he asked hoarsely. "How much money are we talking about?" Dr. Martinez glanced at me for permission before responding. I nodded, understanding that Michael needed to hear the full scope of what he had failed to comprehend about his mother's life. "The initial construction grant was $12 million, she said gently. "But Mrs. Rodriguez has also funded our scholarship program for low-income residents, provided ongoing support for our medical equipment updates, and established an endowment for facility improvements. Her total contribution to Riverside Manor exceeds $15 million. Michael made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. $15 million, he repeated numbly. "Mom, where did this money come from?" "From the business your father and I built," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside me. "From 40 years of buying, renovating, and managing rental properties, from investments and careful financial planning, from the work you dismissed as little landlord problems whenever I tried to discuss it with you. But you live so simply. Your apartment, your car, your clothes." Michael's voice trailed off as he began to understand that everything he thought he knew about my lifestyle had been a deliberate choice rather than a financial limitation. "I live simply because I choose to," I explained. "Because I learned from your grandmother that happiness doesn't come from accumulating possessions, but from using what you have to help others. The money I don't spend on myself goes to causes that matter, like this facility." Dr. Martinez opened her portfolio and withdrew several documents. "Mrs. Rodriguez serves on our anonymous advisory board," she continued, clearly deciding that full transparency was now necessary. "She reviews our annual budgets, approves major policy changes, and provides guidance on resident care standards. We send her monthly reports on everything from occupancy rates to patient satisfaction scores." Michael's face had gone completely white. "You're on the board? You help run this place?" "I don't help run it," I corrected firmly. "I am the primary reason it exists. When I learned about the shortage of affordable quality senior care in our county, I funded this entire project because I wanted to ensure that people like your father's parents, people like me, would have access to dignity and respect in their later years. The implications of what Michael had attempted began to hit him in waves. He had tried to place me in a facility I owned. He had threatened legal action against a woman who sat on the board that oversaw the very institution he thought would solve his problem. He had condescended to explain my own facility's benefits to me as if I were hearing about them for the first time. But the full scope of his humiliation was still unfolding. Dr. Martinez produced another document from her portfolio, a detailed report that I recognized as the kind of background check typically run on potential residents and their families. "When your son initially contacted us about admission," she said, her tone becoming more pointed, "we conducted our standard due diligence. We discovered his inquiries to your physician requesting medical records under false pretenses, his attempts to access your financial information without authorization, and his communications with various professionals in your life claiming you had cognitive impairments." Michael's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He had been so focused on building a case for my incompetence that he hadn't considered that his actions might be documented and reported back to the very person he was trying to control. "We also learned about the threats of legal action if you refused voluntary admission," Dr. Martinez continued relentlessly. "Threats made against our facility's primary benefactor by someone who had no understanding of her actual circumstances or capabilities." The justice of the moment was so complete that it almost felt orchestrated by some cosmic force that had grown tired of Michael's arrogance and decided to deliver a lesson in humility. He had spent weeks crafting what he thought was a clever plan to manage his difficult mother, only to discover that every move he had made was being observed and evaluated by people who knew exactly who I really was. "I need to call Patricia," Michael said suddenly, reaching for his phone with shaking hands. "I need to tell her—" "God, what am I going to tell her?" "You're going to tell her the truth," I said firmly. "You're going to explain that you made assumptions about your mother without bothering to learn the facts. You're going to admit that you violated my privacy, lied to my professional associates, and threatened me with legal action based on complete ignorance of my actual situation." Michael's phone call to Patricia was brief and conducted in hushed, urgent tones in the corner of the lobby. I could hear fragments of his conversation. "No, you don't understand. She owns the place. $15 million. We need to—" When he returned to where Dr. Martinez and I were sitting, his entire demeanor had changed. The confident, controlling man who had walked into Riverside Manor an hour earlier had been replaced by someone who looked lost and ashamed. "Patricia is driving over," he said quietly. She needs to apologize. We both do." Dr. Martinez stood to leave us privacy for what promised to be a difficult family conversation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. And I want you to know that your secret is safe with us. We've always respected your wish for anonymity, and will continue to do so." After she left, Michael and I sat alone, in the lobby of the facility I had built, surrounded by the evidence of accomplishments he had never bothered to discover. The silence between us was heavy with years of misunderstanding and the fresh weight of his betrayal. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping you. I thought you needed protection." "From what?" I asked. "From making my own decisions? From living independently? From having control over my own life? From being alone? From getting hurt again? From—" He stopped, seeming to realize how hollow his justifications sounded in light of what he now knew about my circumstances. "Michael," I said gently, "I was never alone. I have business associates, professional advisors, community connections, and responsibilities you never knew about. I have resources and support systems that extend far beyond what you imagined. The only person I was isolated from was you, because you never bothered to learn who I really am." When Patricia arrived 20 minutes later, her usually composed appearance was disheveled, and her face was streaked with tears. She had clearly received enough information from Michael's phone call to understand that their carefully constructed plan had collapsed in the most spectacular way possible. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, approaching us with obvious reluctance. "I don't know what to say. We had no idea—" "No," I interrupted. "You had no interest in finding out. There's a difference." The three of us sat in that lobby for another hour, working through the immediate practical consequences of what had happened. Michael and Patricia had made deposits and signed preliminary paperwork for my admission that would now need to be canceled. They had contacted numerous people claiming I was cognitively impaired, lies that would need to be retracted. They had damaged relationships and violated trust in ways that would take time and effort to repair. But perhaps most significantly, they had destroyed the illusion that had allowed us to maintain a superficially pleasant family relationship despite our fundamental lack of understanding and respect for each other. There would be no going back to the way things were, because now we all knew exactly how little Michael had thought of his mother's capabilities and worth. As we finally prepared to leave Riverside Manor, I looked around the lobby one last time, seeing it now not just as the facility I had funded, but as the place where my son had finally learned who his mother really was. The lesson had come at a tremendous cost to our relationship, but perhaps it was a price that needed to be paid for any hope of building something honest and respectful in its place. In the days following the revelation at Riverside Manor, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years: the liberating power of being truly seen and acknowledged for who I really was. For decades, I had maintained my anonymity as a philanthropist and downplayed my business success, partly from cultural humility and partly from a desire to protect my privacy. But Michael's betrayal had forced me into the open, and I discovered that stepping out of the shadows brought unexpected benefits. The first change came from Dr. Martinez herself, who called me the morning after our dramatic encounter. Her voice carried a mixture of professional respect and personal warmth that I had rarely experienced from people who knew about my financial contributions. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind my calling, but I wanted to discuss something that occurred to me after yesterday's situation." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your involvement with Riverside Manor has been invaluable, but it's always been conducted through intermediaries and legal representatives. Given what happened, I'm wondering if you might consider taking a more direct role in our operations." The suggestion intrigued me. "What did you have in mind?" "We're expanding our community outreach programs, particularly our advocacy work for senior rights and affordable care access. Your experience, both as a successful businesswoman and as someone who has navigated the challenges of aging while maintaining independence, would be incredibly valuable. We'd love to have you serve as a public spokesperson for these initiatives." The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael had tried to silence me by claiming I was cognitively impaired, but his failed scheme had instead opened a door to using my voice in ways I had never considered. "I'd be honored to discuss this further," I told Dr. Martinez. Within a week, I found myself sitting in the Riverside Manor conference room, no longer hiding behind anonymous donations, but actively participating in strategic planning meetings. The staff, who had previously known me only as a mysterious benefactor, now welcomed me as a colleague and advisor. My decades of business experience, combined with my intimate knowledge of the challenges facing senior community members, made me a valuable contributor to discussions about program development and policy changes. The transition from hidden donor to active advocate felt natural and energizing. For the first time in years, I was using the full scope of my abilities rather than constraining myself to fit other people's limited expectations. The intellectual stimulation of working on complex problems with knowledgeable professionals reminded me how much I had missed being truly engaged with meaningful work. Word of my involvement with Riverside Manor began to spread through the professional networks I had been part of for decades, but had never fully utilized. My property manager, James Wilson, was among the first to congratulate me on what he called, "finally getting the recognition you deserve." "Sofia, I've been managing your properties for 8 years. he said during one of our regular meetings. "I've watched you make decisions that saved struggling tenants from eviction, renovate buildings to improve living conditions even when it reduced your profits, and contribute to community development projects without ever taking credit. It's about time people knew what you've been accomplishing." James's words made me realize that my anonymity, while protecting my privacy, had also prevented me from inspiring others who might benefit from seeing that success was possible for people from backgrounds like mine. How many other immigrant women had assumed that significant philanthropy and business leadership were beyond their reach because they never saw examples of people like themselves in those roles? This realization led to my next opportunity. The city's Chamber of Commerce, learning about my business success and charitable work, invited me to speak at their annual conference about entrepreneurship in immigrant communities. The invitation terrified me. I had never spoken publicly about my personal journey, but it also represented exactly the kind of visibility that could make a real difference. Standing before an audience of business leaders, community organizers, and aspiring entrepreneurs, I told my story publicly for the first time. I spoke about arriving in this country with nothing but determination, about the corporate offices I had cleaned while absorbing business lessons, about the years of sacrifice that had built a property portfolio worth millions, and about the joy of using that wealth to create opportunities for others. The response was overwhelming. Audience members approached me afterward with stories of their own struggles and aspirations, seeking advice about property investment, charitable giving, and balancing business success with community responsibility. Several young women thanked me for showing them possibilities they hadn't imagined for their own futures. That speech led to invitations to serve on the boards of 3 other charitable organizations, all of which were eager to benefit from my business expertise and philanthropic experience. For the first time in my life, I was being recruited for leadership positions rather than working behind the scenes through anonymous donations. The most significant opportunity came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the director of the Latino Community Foundation, contacted me after hearing about my speech at the Chamber of Commerce event. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we've been looking for someone with your combination of business success and commitment to community development to head up a new initiative," she explained during our meeting at her downtown office. "We want to create a program that provides microloans and business mentorship to immigrant entrepreneurs, particularly women who are trying to start their own companies. The position would involve everything I was passionate about, helping people from backgrounds similar to mine, using my business experience to solve practical problems, and creating systemic change rather than just addressing individual needs. It would also mean stepping fully into the public role I had avoided for so many years. The program would require significant fundraising," Maria continued. "But given your philanthropic track record and business connections, we believe you could build something truly transformative. Are you interested in learning more?" I was more than interested. I was excited in a way I hadn't been about work in decades. This wasn't just another board position or charitable commitment. This was an opportunity to create something that could fundamentally change how immigrant women viewed their own potential for business success and community leadership. Within a month, I had accepted the position as founding director of the Immigrant Women's Enterprise Initiative. The Latino Community Foundation provided startup funding, while I committed to contributing both financial support and strategic guidance to get the program established. My first hire was a brilliant young woman named Carmen Delgado, whose MBA and passion for social justice reminded me of myself at a younger age, full of ambition but lacking the mentorship and resources that could accelerate her impact. The work energized me in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of building my property business with Roberto. Every day brought new challenges, developing loan criteria that balanced financial prudence with accessibility, creating mentorship, programs that paired experienced business owners with newcomers, establishing partnerships with banks and community organizations that could extend our reach. Most importantly, I was finally using all of my capabilities, the analytical skills. I had developed through decades of property management, the financial expertise I had gained through successful investing, the community connections I had built through years of anonymous philanthropy, and the cultural understanding that came from my own immigrant experience. The media attention that accompanied my new public role was initially uncomfortable, but ultimately valuable. Local newspapers profiled my journey from cleaning lady to business owner to philanthropist, emphasizing that success was possible for people willing to work hard and think strategically about their goals. The stories generated inquiries from dozens of women who were inspired to start their own businesses or expand their community involvement. One of the most gratifying responses came from a young woman named Isabella Morales, who had read about my work in the city newspaper. She visited my office at the Latino Community Foundation with a business plan for a catering company that would employ other immigrant women while serving authentic food from their home countries. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, her voice shaking, with nervous excitement. "I never thought someone like me could start a real business, but reading about your story made me realize that maybe I could do this." 6 months later, Isabella's catering company had 12 employees and was providing services to corporate clients throughout the city. Her success became one of our program's first major victories, demonstrating that the combination of financial support, mentorship, and encouragement could transform individual lives while strengthening entire communities. As I sat in my new office, reviewing loan applications and preparing for a board meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that humiliating day when Michael had tried to place me in Riverside Manor. His attempt to diminish me had instead forced me to claim my full identity and capabilities. The mother he had tried to silence had become a public advocate for exactly the kind of independence and respect he had tried to deny me. The personal empowerment I felt was profound, but also tinged with sadness. It had taken my son's betrayal to push me into embracing the public role I was clearly meant to play. How many years had I wasted hiding my light under a bushel, maintaining anonymity when visibility could have inspired and helped so many others? But I chose to focus on the opportunities ahead rather than dwelling on lost time. At 72, I was just beginning to understand the full scope of what I could accomplish when I stopped constraining myself to fit other people's limited expectations and started living authentically as the capable, accomplished woman I had always been. The phone calls started 2 weeks after the Riverside Manor incident. Michael would call every few days, his voice tentative and strained, asking if we could meet for coffee or lunch. Each time, I politely declined. I wasn't ready to pretend that things could return to normal, and I suspected that Michael wasn't ready for the difficult conversations that would be necessary if we were going to rebuild our relationship on honest foundations. The first real conversation happened by accident. I was leaving a board meeting at the Latino Community Foundation when I encountered Michael in the parking garage of the downtown office building. He was emerging from the elevator, probably visiting one of his accounting clients, when he spotted me walking toward my car. "Mom," he called out, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "Please, can we talk? Just for a few minutes?" Something in his tone, a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was a young boy, made me stop. He approached, slowly, as if afraid I might flee if he moved too quickly. "I've been wanting to apologize properly," he said when we were face to face. "Not just for what happened at Riverside Manor, but for everything. For all the years I didn't really see you or listen to you." I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding rather than surface regret. "What exactly are you apologizing for, Michael?" He took a deep breath, clearly having rehearsed this moment. "For assuming I knew what was best for you without asking what you wanted. For investigating your private affairs without permission. For lying to your doctor and your business associates. For threatening you with legal action." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "For treating you like you were incompetent when you were actually more accomplished than I ever imagined." It was a comprehensive list, and his delivery seemed sincere. but I needed to understand whether he grasped the deeper issues that had made such behavior possible. "And why do you think you did those things?" I asked. Michael's composure cracked, and for a moment he looked like the confused little boy who used to come to me with problems too big for him to solve alone. Because I was embarrassed by our family's background. Because Patricia's family made me feel like I needed to distance myself from anything that reminded them of where I came from. Because I thought success meant leaving the past behind, and you represented the past. The honesty of his answer was both painful and necessary. At least he was acknowledging the roots of his behavior, rather than simply apologizing for its symptoms. "So you saw me as an embarrassment," I said. "Not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that needed to be acknowledged." "Yes," he whispered. "And I was wrong. Not just about you having money or accomplishments I didn't know about, but about the whole idea that our background was something to be ashamed of. You built something incredible from nothing, and instead of being proud of that, I was trying to hide it." We stood in that parking garage for nearly an hour, having the most honest conversation we'd shared in years. Michael told me about the pressure he felt to fit into Patricia's social circle, about his fear that his immigrant background would limit his career advancement, about the shame he carried over our family's early financial struggles. I shared my own pain about watching him grow distant and condescending, about feeling invisible in his life despite being his mother, about the loneliness of achieving success that I couldn't share with the person whose opinion mattered most to me. I kept my business success quiet, partly to protect my privacy, I explained, but also because I was waiting for you to show interest in who I really was. I wanted you to ask questions, to be curious about my life beyond the limited role you'd assigned me as your aging mother. Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. I never asked because I thought I already knew everything worth knowing. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for all of it. The apology felt genuine, but I knew that sorry wasn't enough to rebuild what had been broken between us. Michael, I appreciate your apology, but I need you to understand that trust takes time to rebuild. You didn't just make one mistake. You demonstrated a pattern of disrespect that went on for years. I know, he said. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I just want a chance to show you that I can do better. Over the following months, Michael began that process of doing better, though it wasn't always smooth or consistent. He started by making formal apologies to all the professionals he had contacted under false pretenses. He called Dr. Foster to retract his claims about my cognitive abilities. He apologized to James Wilson for lying about having authority to discuss my business affairs. He even contacted the admissions coordinator at Riverside Manor to withdraw the application he had submitted without my consent. These weren't easy conversations for someone as proud as Michael, but he completed each one without complaint. More importantly, he began asking genuine questions about my work and interests for the first time in years. Tell me about the Enterprise Initiative, he said during one of our cautious lunch meetings. How does the loan program work? I found myself explaining the microfinance model we had developed, the mentorship component that paired new entrepreneurs with experienced business owners, and the challenges of balancing accessibility with financial responsibility. Michael listened attentively, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated real engagement with the topic. Would you like to see our offices? I offered, and was surprised by how pleased I felt when he accepted immediately. The visit to the Latino Community Foundation was a revelation for both of us. Michael met Carmen Delgado and several of the women who had received loans through our program. He saw the business plans we were reviewing, the success stories we were documenting, and the expansion proposals we were developing for other cities. This is incredible, Mom, he said as we toured the small conference room where I conducted mentorship sessions. You're not just giving away money, you're creating systemic change. His understanding of the broader impact of my work felt like a milestone in our relationship. For years, He had dismissed my interests as little projects, but now he was beginning to grasp the scope and significance of what I had been building. The progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when Michael reverted to his old patterns of assumption and condescension. During one particularly frustrating conversation about my travel plans, he suggested that I might want to consider more age-appropriate destinations. "Michael," I said firmly, "I am planning to visit microfinance programs in Colombia and Guatemala to learn about models we might adapt for our work here. This is business travel, not a vacation, and my age is irrelevant to my ability to conduct this research." He caught himself immediately, looking embarrassed by his automatic response. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm still learning to see you as yourself, instead of as my idea of what an elderly mother should be." These moments of backsliding were frustrating, but also educational. They helped us both recognize how deeply ingrained our dysfunctional patterns had become and how much conscious effort would be required to establish healthier ways of relating to each other. Patricia's journey was more complicated. She had been the primary architect of the social pressure that drove Michael's behavior, and her apologies felt more strategic than sincere. During one awkward family dinner, she made what seemed like a genuine effort to engage with my work. "Sofia, I've been reading about microfinance programs," she said, using my first name for the first time in years. "It's fascinating how small loans can have such significant economic impact." But later that same evening, I overheard her on the phone with one of her friends, describing my philanthropy as sweet little charity work in a tone that suggested she still didn't grasp the scope or sophistication of what I was doing. I realized that Patricia's change would take longer than Michael's, if it happened at all. Her sense of identity was too wrapped up in social hierarchies and class distinctions for her to easily accept that her husband's immigrant mother had achieved more significant success than she had ever imagined possible. But Michael's progress was genuine and accelerating. He began attending some of my public speaking engagements, sitting in the audience with obvious pride as I addressed conferences about immigrant entrepreneurship and community development. After one particularly well-received presentation, he approached me with tears in his eyes. "I wish Dad could have seen this," he said. "He would have been so proud of who you've become." "I haven't become anyone new," I replied gently. "I've just finally been allowed to show who I always was." The relationship we were building wasn't the same as the one we'd lost, but it was better in many ways. It was based on truth rather than assumptions, respect rather than obligation, and genuine interest rather than superficial politeness. Michael was learning to see me as a complete person with my own accomplishments and aspirations, while I was learning to trust that his changed behavior reflected genuine growth rather than temporary guilt. The healing wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be entirely. Too much damage had been done over too many years for us to pretend that everything could return to the way it was before. But we were building something new, something honest. And for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the possibility of having a real relationship with my son. 2 years have passed since that transformative day at Riverside Manor, and as I sit in my new office overlooking the city's downtown district, I'm struck by how completely my life has changed. The woman who once hid her accomplishments behind anonymous donations and modest living has become a recognized leader in immigrant entrepreneurship and senior advocacy. The mother who was nearly silenced by her son's attempt to control her has found her voice in ways that are impacting thousands of lives. The Immigrant Women's Enterprise Initiative has exceeded every goal we set when I founded it. We've provided microloans to over 200 women entrepreneurs, with a repayment rate of 96%, better than most traditional banks achieve with conventional business loans. Our mentorship program has paired successful business owners with newcomers, creating networks of support that extend far beyond our formal programming. Most importantly, we've documented and shared our model with similar organizations in 12 other cities, multiplying our impact exponentially. This morning's board meeting was particularly satisfying. Carmen Delgado, who started as my assistant and has now become the program's operational director, presented our annual report with the confidence and expertise of someone who has found her calling. Isabella Morales, whose catering business was one of our first success stories, now employs 32 people and serves as a mentor in our program, having paid forward the support she received by helping other women launch their own food service enterprises. Mrs. Rodriguez, Isabella said as we reviewed the numbers, "When I first walked into your office 2 years ago, I thought I was just asking for a loan. I had no idea I was joining a movement that would change not just my life, but the lives of all these other women." Her words captured something I've been feeling increasingly as this work has expanded. What began as a response to my own forced emergence from anonymity has become a catalyst for systemic change that extends far beyond anything I could have imagined when Michael first drove me to Riverside Manor under false pretenses. The irony isn't lost on me that his attempt to diminish my independence led to my assuming more public responsibility and influence than I had ever previously wielded. The betrayal that was meant to silence me instead amplified my voice in ways that are creating opportunities for countless other women who might otherwise remain invisible in their own families and communities. My relationship with Michael has continued to evolve, though it bears little resemblance to what existed before our crisis. The superficial politeness that once characterized our interactions has been replaced by genuine engagement, even when we disagree about things. Last month, he attended the Latino Community Foundation's annual gala, where I received their Lifetime Achievement Award for Community Leadership. "Mom," he said during his speech introducing me, "2 years ago, I thought I knew everything about my mother that was worth knowing. I was wrong in ways that almost cost me the opportunity to know one of the most remarkable women I've ever encountered. Tonight we celebrate not just her achievements, but the lesson she taught me about the danger of assumptions and the importance of really seeing the people we love." His words were generous, but more importantly, they reflected genuine understanding of what had transpired between us. The son who once dismissed my thoughts as beyond my intellectual capacity now seeks my advice on business decisions and community involvement. He's even begun volunteering with our mentorship program, using his accounting expertise to help women entrepreneurs understand financial planning and tax obligations. Patricia's transformation has been slower and less complete, but even she has begun to engage differently with my work. She joined the auxiliary board of Riverside Manor and has started volunteering in their activities program, though I suspect this involvement is motivated more by social networking opportunities than genuine commitment to senior advocacy. Still, her participation represents progress from the woman who once viewed my background as an embarrassment to be managed. The most significant change in my life has been the discovery of how fulfilling it is to use all of my capabilities rather than constraining myself to fit other people's limited expectations. For decades, I had accepted a smaller role than I was capable of playing, partly from cultural conditioning and partly from a desire to avoid conflict with family members who preferred me to remain in the background. But being forced into visibility has revealed capacities I didn't know I possessed. Public speaking, which terrified me initially, has become one of my most effective tools for inspiring other women to recognize their own potential. Strategic planning, which I had only applied to my property business, now shapes programs that are being replicated across the country. Leadership skills that I had exercised only in anonymous board positions are now being used to guide organizations and initiatives that bear my name and reflect my values. The recognition has been overwhelming at times. Last month, I was invited to speak at a national conference on immigrant entrepreneurship, sharing the stage with business leaders and policymakers whose names I had previously known only from newspaper articles. The audience of nearly 1,000 people listened attentively as I described the journey from cleaning corporate offices to funding community development projects. Success, I told them, isn't just about what you accumulate, it's about what you make possible for others. And the greatest tragedy isn't failing to achieve your goals, but failing to discover what you're truly capable of achieving because you've accepted other people's limited vision of your potential. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but more meaningful were the conversations afterward with women who approached to share their own stories of hidden capabilities and unrealized ambitions. Many of them had been living constrained lives, accepting roles that utilized only a fraction of their abilities because family members or cultural expectations had convinced them that bigger dreams were inappropriate or unrealistic. These conversations have convinced me that my experience with Michael, while personally painful, represents a much broader social problem. How many capable women are being diminished by family members who love them but can't see them clearly? How many potential leaders are remaining silent because speaking up would challenge comfortable assumptions about who deserves to be heard? This realization has shaped my latest project, a research initiative documenting the economic impact of underutilized immigrant women's capabilities. Working with university researchers, we're quantifying the cost to communities when talented individuals are prevented from contributing their full potential. The preliminary findings suggest that supporting women's entrepreneurship and leadership development creates multiplier effects that benefit entire regional economies. The research is already influencing policy discussions at the state level, where legislators are considering new funding for immigrant integration programs that go beyond basic services to include leadership development and business incubation. If these policies are adopted, they could transform how our society approaches immigrant community development. As I prepare for this afternoon's meeting with the governor's economic development team, I'm struck by how different my life is from what I could have imagined just 2 years ago. The quiet philanthropist who preferred anonymity has become a public advocate whose opinions are sought by policymakers and media outlets. The mother who was nearly silenced by her son's misguided intervention has found her voice in forums that can influence systemic change. Most importantly, the woman who once accepted being underestimated has learned to insist on being seen and heard for who she really is. This lesson has been painful but transformative, not just for me, but for everyone whose life has been touched by the work that emerged from that painful crisis. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Michael had never driven me to Riverside Manor that day, if he had never forced the confrontation that shattered our polite but dishonest relationship. Would I have continued living quietly, making anonymous donations but never fully utilizing my potential for public leadership? Would hundreds of women entrepreneurs have missed opportunities because the programs I founded never existed? The questions are unanswerable, but they remind me that even betrayals can become blessings if we're willing to use them as catalysts for growth rather than excuses for bitterness. Michael's attempt to diminish me forced me to claim my full identity and capabilities. His betrayal became the foundation for a transformation that has enriched not just my life, but the lives of countless others who have benefited from the work that emerged from that crisis. As I look out my office window at the bustling city below, I see a community that is stronger because talented individuals are being supported in using their full potential. I see women who might otherwise have remained invisible now leading businesses, mentoring others, and contributing to economic development in ways that create opportunities for entire families and neighborhoods. This is the ultimate victory over the forces that tried to silence me. Not just the restoration of my own voice, but the amplification of voices that might otherwise never have been heard. The betrayal that was meant to end my independence instead launched a movement that is helping to redefine what's possible for women like me, and like the countless others who are just beginning to discover what they're truly capable of achieving. 5 years later. The auditorium at State University was packed to capacity, with overflow seating set up in the adjacent conference rooms for those watching via live stream. I stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to my navy blazer, listening to Dean Patricia Morrison deliver my introduction to the graduating class of the business school. Today's commencement speaker exemplifies the transformative power of perseverance, vision, and the courage to redefine what's possible, she was saying. From humble beginnings as an immigrant cleaning offices downtown, she built a multi-million-dollar business empire, revolutionized approaches to senior care, and founded programs that have supported over 800 women entrepreneurs across 15 states. Through the curtain, I could see the sea of caps and gowns, proud families with cameras ready, and faculty members seated on the stage. But my eyes were drawn to a particular section of the audience where Michael sat with Patricia and their two teenagers, my grandkids who had grown up hearing very different stories about their grandmother than the ones their father had once believed. Her work has been featured in Harvard Business Review, and she was recently named one of Forbes' most influential women over 70, Dean Morrison continued. But perhaps her greatest achievement is proving that it's never too late to step into your full potential and use your voice to create change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sofia Rodriguez, recipient of our first ever Doctor of Humane Letters degree, and this year's commencement speaker, Dr. Rodriguez. Even after receiving the honorary doctorate 6 months ago, the title still felt surreal. The university had insisted on conferring the degree when they learned about the scope of my work and its national impact. You've contributed more to economic development and social justice than most of our PhD graduates, the president had explained. This recognition is long overdue. As I walked to the podium, the applause was thunderous and sustained. I took a moment to absorb the scene. Hundreds of young people at the beginning of their careers, looking to the future with hope and ambition. Among them were 3 graduates from our Enterprise Initiative program, women who had started with microloans and were now receiving their MBAs. Graduates, families, faculty, and friends, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 5 years ago, if someone had told me I would be standing here today, delivering a commencement address at this prestigious university, I would have thought they were confused about who I was. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. My story had been covered extensively in local and national media, becoming something of a phenomenon that business schools used as a case study in late-life reinvention and social entrepreneurship. But that's exactly the point I want to leave with you today. We are all more capable, more resilient, and more powerful than we often allow ourselves to believe. Sometimes it takes a crisis, even a betrayal, to force us to discover our true potential. I spoke for 20 minutes about the importance of authenticity, about the danger of accepting other people's limited vision of what we can achieve, and about the responsibility that comes with success to create opportunities for others. But mostly, I spoke about the unexpected gifts that can emerge from our most difficult moments. The worst day of my life became the catalyst for the most meaningful work I've ever done, I told them. Not because the betrayal was somehow good or necessary, but because I chose to use it as a starting point for growth rather than an ending point for dreams. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. As I looked out at the crowd, I saw Michael wiping his eyes, his expression a mixture of pride and what I had come to recognize as ongoing amazement at the woman his mother had revealed herself to be. After the ceremony, at the reception hosted by the university, I was surrounded by graduates and their families wanting to share their own stories and ask for advice. But the conversation that meant most to me happened when Michael approached with his 16-year-old daughter, Elena. "Grandma Sofia," Elena said, using the name she had adopted after learning about my work. "I've been accepted to the summer business program at Stanford. Mom and Dad said I should ask you about entrepreneurship and social impact." The request filled me with joy that was almost overwhelming. Elena was asking me for guidance not out of polite obligation, but because she genuinely respected my expertise and wanted to learn from my experience. The grandmother, who had once been seen as an embarrassment, was now viewed by her grandchild as a role model and mentor. "I'd be honored to share what I've learned," I told her. "But first, tell me about your own ideas and interests. What problems do you see in the world that you think you might want to help solve?" As Elena launched into an enthusiastic description, of her ideas for sustainable fashion and ethical manufacturing, I caught Michael's eye. He was watching our conversation with the kind of attention and respect that had become characteristic of our interactions since our relationship had been rebuilt on honest foundations. Later that evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing notes for tomorrow's board meeting, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The Enterprise Initiative had grown beyond anything I had originally envisioned, with satellite programs in 15 states and a national conference that drew attendees from across the country. Riverside Manor had become a model for other facilities, with 3 additional locations funded through the foundation I had established. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I understood my own story. For decades, I had thought of myself primarily as someone who had survived difficult circumstances and achieved modest success through hard work and careful planning. I had minimized my accomplishments and hidden my capabilities, partly from humility and partly from a desire to avoid conflict with family members who preferred me to remain in the background. The crisis with Michael had forced me to recognize that this self-diminishment wasn't just harmful to me. It was harmful to everyone who might have been inspired or helped by seeing what was possible for people from backgrounds like ours. By hiding my light under a bushel, I had been depriving my community of a model of what immigrant women could achieve when given the opportunity to use their full potential. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Carmen Delgado, calling from our Seattle office where she was establishing our newest program location. "Sofia, the meeting with the mayor's office went even better than we hoped," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "They're committing city funding for the first year, and 3 local banks have agreed to participate in the loan program. We could be operational within 6 months." Carmen's success filled me with the kind of pride I imagined parents feel when their grown children achieve their own significant accomplishments. She had started as my assistant, learned every aspect of our work, and was now capable of launching new programs independently. More importantly, she had developed her own vision for how the work could evolve and expand. "That's wonderful news," I told her. "You've done incredible work building those partnerships." "I learned from the best," she replied. "Sofia, I hope you know how much your example has meant to all of us. You didn't just create these programs. You showed us what's possible when we refused to accept other people's limitations." After we hung up, I sat quietly in my office, surrounded by awards and photographs that documented a transformation I could never have imagined when Michael first drove me to Riverside Manor 5 years ago. The betrayal that had seemed like an ending had instead been a beginning, not just for me, but for hundreds of other women whose lives had been touched by the work that emerged from that painful crisis. The lesson wasn't that betrayal is somehow good or necessary for growth. The lesson was that we have choices about how we respond to the most difficult moments in our lives. We can allow them to diminish us, or we can use them as raw material for building something meaningful and lasting. At 77, I was busier and more fulfilled than I had ever been at any point in my life. The woman who had once been nearly silenced was now being asked to share her voice at universities, conferences, and policy forums across the country. The mother who had been dismissed as cognitively impaired was now advising government officials on immigrant integration strategies and economic development policies. Most importantly, the person who had spent decades hiding her capabilities was now using them fully, not just for her own satisfaction, but to create opportunities for others who might otherwise remain invisible in their own families and communities. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the graduates I had addressed that morning, young people at the beginning of their adult journeys. My hope for them was that they would never need to experience the kind of crisis that had forced me to discover my own potential. But if they did face such challenges, I hoped they would remember that endings can become beginnings, that betrayals can become catalysts, and that it's never too late to step into the fullness of who you were meant to be. The greatest victory over those who try to diminish us isn't just surviving their attempts to control or silence us. It's using our voices, once found, to help others discover their own power and potential. The echo of our authenticity can ripple through communities and generations, creating change that extends far beyond our individual stories. That, I had learned, was the true meaning of transformation. Not just changing ourselves, but using our changed selves to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.